Okay, so there is a point where you are just going to need to sit down and memorize your stuff. It is not the glamorous part. It's not necessarily the fun part. It is repetitive. It does take time unless you're really lucky and have an amazing memory. I wasn't one of those people. So we're just going to give you a couple of tips on how to memorize your work. There really aren't shortcuts, so I wouldn't call them shortcuts, but I would say that they are ways that you can sort of make sure that you've got the content in your head. Because the thing is, you only have, you've only got a very limited amount of time. And I always think that you want to make sure you know your stuff well enough to be writing the whole time during the exam, outside of the time that you take to think about how you're going to be answering the question. So obviously you need time to underline the keywords. You can do a little bit of this in reading time, but you will need working time to underline the keywords, figure out synonyms, figure out how you're going to address the question in each of your paragraphs, and then start your writing. But then once you're underway, there should never really be a point where you're sitting there going, oh, like, what's that technique? Oh, what's the next line? Because that actually does take up a lot of your time. Okay. So you shouldn't be in a position where you can't remember things. So that takes repetition. And that's one of the things we're going to go through. So Lily's going to give us some pointers on how to do that.
Yeah, great. Okay. So yeah, as we said, like memorizing your essays is often like the biggest thing that students come up with as a really big challenge as they approach the HSC, because you have so many essays and so many different modules, let alone the fact that you also have subjects that aren't English. Like you also have to be memorizing stuff for all your other subjects. So how do you approach that, and how do you give yourself like study notes for English? So a lot of students come to me and they're like, I don't know how to create study notes for English because I just have this big chunk of writing, this big essay, that I'm trying to remember. My other subjects, you can just bullet point it by a rubric, like it just feels a bit easier, but English just feels really daunting. So in terms of like creating those study notes, I always tell students to create what I've got here, which is a cheat sheet. And I found that this has been really helpful for students to just help them with the memorizing process. So we'll just go through the scaffold. So essentially you can do this however you want, but I just found in my own HSC experience, this was really the ticket to my success, was just to have a cheat sheet for every module that I could just go to and go, okay, this is a bullet pointed version of my essay. I can kind of see the scaffold in my head and I can memorize from here, and also just practice writing out this scaffold when I don't have the time to practice writing out an entire essay. So you can do this in about 5 minutes, because the scaffold really should not be more than 2 pages really. So, okay, so first of all, I have found a lot of students have wanted to memorize the introduction word for word. Like that's possibly the only part of this, the piece that they really want to memorize word for word. However, you could bullet point it if you wanted to. This is an example of a To Kill a Mockingbird one, so it's a younger year, but the same example still applies. So this student here has chosen to memorize most of it. I've had other students have just highlighted the key points, or they've just bullet pointed it in the sentences and just the keywords that they want to remember. So you start with that. Then this is the part where it becomes a lot more up to you and what you choose to want to remember. But essentially, break it up paragraph by paragraph. Have your point sentence. Again, point sentences are ones you probably want to remember the most word for word, because you've probably word it in a way where you've got your key ideas. However, you could just write a couple of key ideas and then you can say what my student's written here, which is just remember to link to the question. That's just a quick note for himself. Then we've got context, which you can bullet point here just really quickly, just the key lines that you need to remember. And then get into your evidence and just have a really quick snapshot where you can just see it in your head and it's just really clearly bullet pointed. So what I like here is this student, for quotes that he's really confident with, he's just written the technique and he's like, okay, I'm good. I just need to see the technique and the quote and I'm good. Whereas for other ones, he's needed to write a little bit longer because maybe he's just struggling to remember more of the analysis of that point. So he's just written a couple of notes to himself underneath about how to remember that one and what the key ideas surrounding that analysis is. So it's up to you how little or how much you want to put on your cheat sheet. I also know that I have other students who have to see things in color. So this student, the bolding for the technique works for him just to see and differentiate. However, other students might want to color code the quote, the technique, and the analysis and learn from color. I know when I was a student, color was really important to me. If it wasn't highlighted, I wasn't going to remember it. So that's something that you can also do. And then ending with a length sentence here. And then go through and do the same thing for the other paragraphs. So just your point, your context, and your quotes, just broken up in a nice way that's really accessible for you and includes as much or as little information as you want that you need to memorize. Yeah, and then once you have your scaffold that looks like this, you can just practice writing it out multiple times. So a lot of my students will just read through the cheat sheet. They'll give themselves 5 minutes to read it, and then they'll flip it down, do a look, cover, write, check thing, and then give themselves another 5 to 10 minutes to just practice writing out those bullet points. And then they'll find that they're actually remembering a lot more of their essay than they thought. And so when it comes into the HSC, that's already there, ready to go. They've got the bullet points in their head. They can see it, like it's a very clear visual image if you're a visual learner. And yeah, so it becomes more about answering the question and dedicating the time to that than actually memorizing or trying to recall the information that you've memorized. So yeah, that's a really good strategy that you can use.
Absolutely. And I did want to just add for the introduction, I probably would go with the dot point strategy, just because sometimes when you try memorize an introduction, it becomes really difficult to step away from what you've prepared and use, like really properly think about how the words of the question should be integrated, you know. So really you should be using the words of the question to write your introduction, but you definitely need to know what goes into an introduction. What are your key points? What's the context, etc. But yeah, maybe you know, doing it by dot points and as opposed to learning the sentences word for word might make it a little bit easier to just incorporate the words of the question. Similar thing for the paragraphs. The topic sentences are a really, really important place for you to use the words of the question in there. So don't get too attached to how it looks on your memorized sheet, but do make sure that you have a clear idea of how to articulate your actual ideas, and that you know, you remember the context and so forth. Another thing I'll add as well is that sometimes students feel like when they get into the exam, they get like they just forget, like they'd have like a brain freeze or something. I promise you, a brain freeze is a product of you not knowing it well enough. So what you need to do to make sure that doesn't happen in an exam is, when you're practicing writing out your essays and you know it well enough to write it without your notes, do not look at your notes when you get stuck. If you get stuck and you go, oh, like I just want to have a quick peek and then I'll just keep going, it'll be fine. That point where you let yourself have the peak is the point at which you are going to have a brain freeze in your exam. So you have to practice pushing on in your practice time so that doesn't happen in the exam. So what I would always do is I would put a little asterisk if I forgot something, and I would just force myself to keep writing, because ultimately that's what I'm going to have to do in the exam. After I finished the practice paper, then I would go back to the bit that I couldn't remember and go over it and remember it. And I would be much more likely to remember it well after I finished the response and came back to look at it, rather than just doing that little peek and then probably having no idea what I actually forgot when I came to the end of it, at which point then I wasn't really able to go back and learn it properly. So having that asterisk is a really good way to know what you've got to go back and revise. So then you go back and revise it, you write it out again, and you'll probably remember it the next time, but you keep writing it out until you do. You should write it out at least 5 to 10 times per essay, not looking at any notes to a new question under time conditions, to make sure that you not only know it really well, you can remember it and you can answer the question and you can get it done in the time frame that they actually give. So those are our tips there. We do have another couple of other videos on this, so go and have a look there. We've got plenty on all the different modules, and if there's anything else that you want us to create something on, feel free to pop a comment below.